Hello everyone. We are going to see about the forms of crime. Based on the topic terrorism. Terrorism. Terrorism involves violence against public, with a political or religious desire. Terrorist acts are organized so as to attract large attention. Terrorists use acts of violence for frightening the group of peoples or pressuring the government to do or not do something. Many countries give aid and dangerous weapons to the terrorist groups in order to weaken the other country. In most cases, terrorism is a bludgeon of small groups, fighting against governments that are more well-known and better armed. Terrorism. Definitions. In 1994, the United Nations General Assembly has continually condemned terrorist acts using the following political depiction of terrorism. Criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public, a group of persons or particular persons for political purposes are in any circumstance unjustifiable, whatever the considerations of a political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or any other nature that may be invoked to justify them. Types of terrorism. Bioterrorism, cyberterrorism, eco-terrorism, nuclear terrorism, macro-terrorism, political terrorism, religious terrorism, intimate terrorism, pathological terrorism, separatist terrorism, bioterrorism. In this type of terrorism, the biological toxins are used to hurt and frighten innocent citizens, in the name of a political or other cause. The U.S. Center for Disease Control has categorized the viruses, bacteria, and toxins that could be used in an attack. They are anthrax, Bacillus anthracis, botulism, Clostridium botulinum toxin, the plague, Yersinia pestis, smallpox, Variola major, tularemia, Francisella tularensis, hemorrhagic fever, due to Ebola virus or Marburg virus. Cyberterrorism. In this type of terrorism, the terrorists utilize information technology to affect public at large and get attention to their aim. This may mean that they use information technology, like telecommunications, computers, and internet, as a tool to organize a conventional attack. In cyber terrorism, by using information technology would radically interrupt the services which are connected with internet. For example, cyber terrorists can hack into networks housing for getting critical financial information or disable networked emergency systems. Cyber terrorism is a use of internet for terrorist activities like large-scale disruption of computer networks, especially computers attached to the internet, by the means of computer viruses. Eco-terrorism. Eco-terrorism is new type of terrorism, using violence for interest of environment. For example, the environmental extremists damage property of industries to save the animals and natural environment. These industries include logging companies, fur companies, and animal research laboratories.
In the middle of downtown in a major city, people are going to work, studying for exams, are lost in their thoughts and daily lives. Right here, a nuclear weapon is detonated and time freezes. The first phase of the explosion happens within less than a second. In a millisecond, a ball of plasma hotter than the sun appears and grows in a fireball to more than 2 kilometers across. Within this ball, everyone is just gone. Think of water dripped onto a very hot pan. A sizzle, and then there's nothing. Most buildings, cars, trees, tacky sculptures, and people.
Nuclear terrorism. Narco-terrorism. Political terrorism. Nuclear terrorism means different type of use of nuclear material by the terrorists. It includes attacking nuclear facilities, preparing nuclear weapons or purchasing nuclear weapons, or finding ways to scatter radioactive materials. It means using of violence by drug traffickers to prevent the government to stop the drug trade. In the last decade, the drug traffickers used violence for assisting the other terrorist acts. Terrorism means use of violence in order to create fear in the civilians for political purpose. The terrorist groups usually use violence to overthrow or destabilize the government, but in some cases, the dictatorial governments also use terror to maintain their power or to suppress their opponents. Religious terrorism. In this type of terrorism, the terrorist groups perform terrorist activities on the basis of faith-oriented tenets. From centuries, the terrorist acts have been performed on religious basis with a view to spread or enforce a system of belief or opinion of their religion on others. In this type of terrorism, does not necessarily define a specific religious view, but usually defines the view of groups of people or interpretation of teachings that believe. Intimate terrorism. Intimate terrorism means the control by one partner over the other. This type of terrorism also involves emotional and psychological abuse. This type terrorism is likely to increase over the time. Intimate terrorism is of two types, generally violent antisocial and dysphoric borderline. The first type includes person with psychopathic and violent tendencies. In second type, peoples are emotionally reliant upon the relationship. The acts of violence by a person against his or her intimate partner is usually made as a method for controlling his or her partner. This type of violence is not frequent. Pathological terrorism. Separatist terrorism. In this type of terrorism, the individuals use violence strategies for their enjoyment by terrorizing others. This type of persons usually function alone instead of in groups. These types of persons are not true terrorists as they not have any well-defined political aim. In this type of terrorism, the terrorist groups want to divide the country for establishing a new nation. This kind of terrorism is basically of minorities within a nation that desire their own state, generally due to discrimination from the majority of citizens or government. The most famous examples are the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, EPA Basque separatists in Spain, the Kurdish PKK in Turkey, the Chechen terrorists in Chechnya, and the Quebec Liberation Front in Canada. Thank you for your support. Keep watching and subscribe now to stay update only on 2D Media. Future criminologist Kutakudi follows on FB, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn.